We shift now a little bit, and this is a continuation of the Gasson and Waters example. So here they're using a networking tool, a social networking tool, to trace the interaction patterns. And you probably recognize this. This is a quantitative strategy. There's nothing qualitative in this particular image. This is a quantitative strategy. So the numbers are the individuals, and the darker the line, as you know, with social network analysis, the more interaction occurred. So they there's a whole nother type of analysis they could have done by the clusters of people interacting, but they were focused on the individual, not on the cluster. So you've got an intensity measure by the darkness of the line. It's a quantitative indicator, how much they were communicating. And then you can see their impact in the sense that the thought leaders are more and more people are responding to their posts. So that's part of what you see is the picking up ideas from a post, which means generally that the thought leader, in my experience, would mean they come in pretty early. So here you've got quantitative data. Now here you have another way. This is called a joint display, same study. Here's the categories they created. I think I said there were 6. Initiator, facilitator, closer, complicator, peer elicitor, contributor, vicarious, awkward or something. I don't know what the last one was. And so they had the potential to trace it over time. So week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. So there's your time dimension. So they're recording what percentage of these conversations were occupied by people in these different groups. So this is a joint display in that it's the qual dimension. It's organized by the qual dimension. So it's organized by these. And they were identified through a qual procedure called thematic analysis. So the big trace here is that I think it's showing, and they're calling it initiator here, sort of less role for them as time progresses. But that's not my point in showing you this. It's not really, it's just one way of, this is integration. It's one way of integrating the data. Now I mentioned that a young man, he probably would resent me calling him young, but he just finished his dissertation. And he did a fantastic study that came out in 2021 in December. And by January, this article, which had been rejected by 2 previous journals, had already been like downloaded 2,000 times. This is a very, very original use of mixed methods. So it's student learning ecologies in online higher education, a model to support connected learning across contexts. So it was his dissertation. His name is Mitchell Peters. He lives in Spain. I talked to him yesterday, but he's Canadian. He spent a lot of time in Spain. And he started with a theoretical model which played out into both the qualitative and quantitative data he collected. And in the end, I'm going to summarize this awkwardly because it's complicated to explain. But he took the results of his different analytical procedures and presented it in this final sort of theoretical model. There's no quantity element in this model. So he's not quantifying anything like the previous ones. But he has built a multi-layered type of figure through his different procedures. So the rings are like the results of different procedures. This is a very original article. I'm trying to persuade him to take on doing a special issue about mixed methods in the context of online learning for the journal that I work with. I think I maybe have some more about his. So let's switch a little bit and go back. So I tried to give you two examples to show you that this environment is so perfect for mixed methods because of what I've already talked about. So let's fill the promise of talking about the difference between integrated and non-integrated designs. So when you go back to that little Venn diagram where I defined mixed methods, I said the circles could be bigger, you know. The amount of interaction overlap between the qualitative and quantitative can be really different too. So that's what I mean by non-integrated designs and fully integrated designs. And then there's something in between. Okay, so let me see if I can just give you a picture of those. So a non-integrated design, that's the one I mentioned before. It's like you got two railroad tracks and maybe they're running side by side, or maybe one goes first and then the other, but they're not interwoven like this, right, throughout. And fully integrated designs, they're just hand in glove, you could say, hand in glove. They, and the Peters study is an example of hand in glove. There's something in between called a hybrid design. So the hybrid design can begin with the separate tracks, collect the qual, analyze the qual, collect the quant, analyze the quant, then you bring them together. How might you bring them together? Maybe you use the qual to create factors from a survey after you generated the themes in the qual. So that's a really good example of how a hybrid. So a hybrid has some of both, you know, some what they call sequential, one after the other, or parallel, and then it brings it together. So this is an example, which I gave him a hard time about when I talked to him. So this is also from Peters, because he used boilerplate. And that it really doesn't fit his design. But here's an example of someone, if you just look at this, that's a sequential design. And he calls his design sequential. So first he did this, then he did this, then he did this, and then he brought them together. So he had a sensitizing model. He collected his qual, which was documents and observation. He analyzed his qual using thematic analysis. He took his qual, see, there's quite a bit of mixing going on right in here. So he took the qual concepts to structure a survey. Then he analyzed his survey, and then he pulled them together. So here is a nice and tidy sequential design. It looks separate. It's like phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. It's probably not that, in real life, it's probably not that tidy, right? Now, Tedley and Tashikori, I adapted their language in my book when I talked about fully integrated mixed methods research. So let me introduce that idea just a little bit. This is how they portrayed it. But let me see if I could flesh out different ways, different different ways that integration could occur at all the phases. So by using dotted lines, they're really saying that they're informing each other. And the easiest way to understand that is how, regardless of the timing, perhaps that you finish your, I don't know how one person can be doing two things at one time, but in mixed methods, they imagined that a person could do parallel. So I don't know many people that would be doing their quant and their qual analysis simultaneously, like Monday and Tuesday, you do your quant analysis, and Wednesday and Thursday, you do your qual. And then I guess on Friday, you do mixed. But they imagine that you could do parallel. This works great with teams, but it's a little more challenging for individuals because they usually do it sequentially. But all it means is you get an interesting finding from your quant, let's say, and maybe that has you go, no, it's more likely to be this way. This is a classic example of how this could work here in the middle. So you get a finding, and usually it's like maybe you're puzzled by a quant finding. It doesn't make sense to you, like it's counterintuitive. And so you go to your qual finding to revisit and try to understand that. So the middle is the most important part. So let me give you an example of that. In her dissertation, a student named something Wesley studied teaching learning environment, but it was for intensive language learning. So people who were students, early adolescents, who were taking intensive language instruction in Canada. It's like in Canada, I think they try to have their students learn French. So she had this model of agency and motivation, and she figured the most motivated people would be the most motivated students, the ones who love the language, would be the ones who was most likely to stay enrolled, because this was an optional program. Okay, this sort of fits our understanding of motivation theory, right? Motivated people likely to stay, less motivated people not less likely to stay. Seems pretty simple. Didn't work out that way at all. The most motivated students, her quantitative indicator, were the one most likely to withdraw from the program. So she had quantitative data, and she had to go back to her qualitative data to sort of say, what's going on here, right? And really, I think the subtext of this was the most motivated students, as we all know from studies of creativity and probably motivation, they were interested in a lot of things. It wasn't that they were only interested in language. They had a lot of competing interests. So the most motivated students had a lot of competing interests. And there is an example of that. It's not just the qual finding, it's not just the quant finding. You don't just stop there. It's like, how do you explain that the most motivated people are leaving the program? And that doesn't fit theory at all. So Pat Baisley, who is another one of the big voices in the early days, still very powerful writer about mixed methods. She does not cut any punches. Pat Baisley is from Australia. She, I know her well. I think she was a cattle rancher for a while, among her many things. So she just says, the strategy that is most destructive of coherent integration is to work through complete analysis of each of the separate sources of data types available before considering how they might be integrated. So the idea of keeping them separate without any intentional integration is a real weakness in design. Now, this is probably too much information, but we talked about doing this distinction. So I got to thinking about these, and let me just make a distinction, some simple distinctions between the non-integrated designs, the hybrid designs, and the integrated designs. There are some big advantages to keeping them separate. Surprise, since I wrote a book called Fully Integrated, but let me tell you what the advantages are. This is a common team approach. To construct a team, you have a qual person, a quant person, you forget to have a mixed methods person. Let's say the quant person's at Vanderbilt and the qual person is in Hong Kong. You don't meet very often. The qual person takes the qual data, the quant person takes the quant data, and you have a very efficient division of labor. So it's a very practical design. It affords less surprises. It's easier to plan. It's probably easier to allocate resources. So as soon as you move into integrated designs, because of the likelihood of this exposing paradoxical findings, you introduce uncertainty. It's hard to set your timeline that you're going to finish the discussion chapter at X time, because think about Wesley and her dissertation. Here her quantitative data just seems to completely disprove her entire theoretical framework. So she has to step back and go back to the qual. So there's far less control in the integrated designs. They require a higher level of interaction among team members. They normally suggest that in integrated designs are really facilitated when team members have overlapping expertise. So in other words, the qual person knows a little bit about quant, enough to get by. The quant person knows and respects the qual, enough to get by, no experts, right? But there's enough overlap that when the quant person comes in with their results, or the qual person comes in with their results, you can make some sense out of it. Like I consider myself largely qual now, but I wasn't trained in qual. But I can understand a hierarchical model. I can understand the implications. I'm not great at the statistical assumptions, but I can grasp it. So it requires more expertise, more overlapping expertise, at least in terms of the methodology. Sometimes you begin thinking you have a non-integrated design and then it becomes integrated, because of these sort of unexpected findings. So let's switch now. I don't want to, we're good on time, I think. Let me give you one of the most common questions in mixed methods is how do you mix? And what I'm interested isn't, some trivial idea of mixing, but a serious type of mixing that affects the quality of your findings or your results. So I'm talking about the type of mixing that impacts your findings, the depth of your findings. So counting your number of participants or counting the number of times that people said, for instance, in qual, showing a table that reports the frequency of certain themes and then stops there. That doesn't, I guess you could say it impacts your understanding of your data, but that's not a very significant use of mixing. That's a trivial use of mixing. And that upsets the qual people. So here are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ways to mix during analysis in ways that can generate that synthetic insight. I'm going to show you a couple examples of these. One is the whole idea of graphic elicitation. Now, graphic elicitation is, let's say in your context, let's say you were interviewing someone on Zoom and you showed them their interaction pattern. So here's what you did, here's who you were dealing with in 1, and here's who you're week 1 and week 2, 3. So you're using it to collect more authentic data. The example I'm going to show you is timelining, which is just amazing. Case-based analysis is when you integrate your qualitative and quantitative data about a unit of analysis. It could be a student, so you create a case study of a student. Could be a classroom. It could be a learning strategy. It could be a school. It could be a learning community. So you create a narrative profile usually that weaves together both your qualitative and your quantitative data into a whole. And then you do a comparison. Easy to imagine, I mentioned the architectural context. They study space. Space and usually public space. And it's easy to imagine how you'd have a lot of data about a public space. And you could weave that together to compare the different spaces. I've already shown you a couple of joint displays, which are figures that deliberately align data from different sources about key constructs. I showed you this one here, the integrated model, which combines, it's a theoretical model that combines qual and quant constructs and paths. And then intermethod mixing is like when you put mixed methods with social network analysis, mixed methods with grounded theory, mixed methods with GIS is another one that's very popular too. So these are big, strong ways to get serious about bringing your data together. Not necessarily your data, well, your data and or your findings. Here's another example. I won't go into this too much. I've been playing around with this idea. I really mostly want to show you about co-occurring data. So I said in the beginning, one of the ways that I think your environment is so perfect for mixed methods to study teaching and learning is because you have naturally co-occurring data. It's naturally linked. It comes together. So I've been playing around with using book indexes. I know this is a little bit off the topic for you guys, but I think it's a really fun idea as a way to sort of see changes over time. But an index, point isn't what I'm doing with it. The point is it's co-occurring natural data. So here's a book index. This is my index. These are authors. So you see the author, a book index, is linked to the pages where they are cited. So what you have essentially here is an intensity index. So you can see, I picked this one. I told you that Jennifer Green was very influential to me, her work has been very influential to me. So you could see that if you counted the number of times I cited her, you can have the weight, you can create a quantitative index of how much she influenced me. Now, I know none of you are going to do indexes, But you see the beginning of how you're aligning the data in an Excel spreadsheet, wherever it might be, and I'll show you another example in a minute. You're aligning the data in a way that allows you to link it, right? So here we got a word, a quality dimension, so you might say, and you have an intensity measure. The second way, and this touches on resources, you guys are probably all really good with technology based on what you do for a living. This is a snapshot of a screen of qualitative software. So there's a couple of big qualitative softwares that work great with mixed methods. One's Atlas TI, one's Deduce, one's QSR and Vivo. These allow you to incorporate images, sounds, maps, and to move back and forth between them, interview transcripts. So this is a screenshot of a qualitative software. They have a coding scheme here. So, but they can engage their interview data. This is probably a think out loud protocol where they talk to these young people while they were doing their drawings and moving back and forth interactively. So it's a very integrated, approach. So you start with co-occurring data. You create some way to engage them. Excel works fine unless you're going to get into a multimedia. Excel is a great way to start. The qualitative software, it's like once you get so much data, you absolutely have to use it. And I can quantify that more for you when we get to questions.